Energy, chemical elements, and nutrients form a cycle in nature. What are those elements and how can those elements affect our life? Good day everyone, I'm Laika Marlene R. Samson and I'm here to present the biological cycle. The biological cycle is the cycle of elements that forms in nature. In course of biological cycle, the element can take various chemical forms. There are 4 important cycles in nature. They are oxygen cycle, water cycle, carbon cycle, and nitrogen cycle. In nature, nothing really stays in one place for eternity and nothing disappears either. Most of the chemicals or elements are either consumed or produced by the living things. And when they are consumed or produced by the living things, they can become part of bigger molecules. The element can change their state. For instance, the water can become vapor or ice. And the chemical or element can become part of much simpler molecules such as oxides, salts, acid, etc. So, those molecules from this element can become part of cell, of plant, bacteria, archaea, and fungi. It can also form rock, and it can be dissolved in water and portions of air that we breathe. If we use an arrow to follow the path of these elements, we are most likely to draw a circle. Such natural cycles are called biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycle is a substance turnover or cycling of substances in a pathway by which chemical substance moves through biotic or the biosphere and abiotic, which is the lithosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere components of Earth. The biogeochemical cycle can make multiple biological processes possible such as photosynthesis, protein synthesis, and respiration. Many stages of this cycle could not be possible without the activity of living beings, bacteria, fungi, plants, and animals. So now that we know the biogeochemical cycles, without further ado, let's study the first important cycle in our nature, which is the oxygen cycle. Oxygen cycle. The oxygen is the most important element in our life because without it, we cannot survive. Yet, in our atmosphere, there is only 21% of free oxygen. And the high content of oxygen in our atmosphere is something that we came about very slowly every year. Aside from atmosphere, oxygen is also present in hydrosphere and lithosphere. And in the circulation and recycling of oxygen within the biosphere is called the oxygen cycle. This cycle includes both biotic and abiotic components. As you can see on the figure, the oxygen cycle reservoir such as atmosphere, biosphere, and lithosphere, and the hydrosphere, and the flux or the flow of oxygen cycle. These are the steps of oxygen cycle. These are the stages of oxygen cycle. First, all green plants during photosynthesis releases oxygen back to atmosphere as a byproduct. And then, all aerobic organisms use oxygen for respiration. The next, animal exhale carbon dioxide back in atmosphere, which is again used by plants during photosynthesis. And now, oxygen is balanced within the atmosphere. The oxygen is used by humans and other living organisms in breathing, decomposition, combustion, and rusting. And the oxygen produced by plants and sunlight by photolysis, which is the destruction of water molecules in atmosphere through the energy of sunlight. Here are interesting facts about oxygen. Did you know that the phytoplankton is the most significant producers of oxygen, followed by terrestrial plants and trees? Carbon cycle. Carbon cycle and oxygen cycle is somewhat related to each other. Carbon dioxide is the cycle process where carbon compounds are interchanged among the biosphere, geosphere, pedosphere, hydrosphere, and other atmosphere of Earth. These are the carbon cycle steps. Carbon that is present in atmosphere is absorbed by plants by photosynthesis. Next, these plants then consumed by animals, and other carbon get bioaccumulated in their bodies. These animals and plants eventually die, and upon decomposing, carbon released back in the atmosphere. Some of carbon that is not released back in atmosphere eventually became fossil fuel. These are carbon cycle steps. First, the carbon that is present in atmosphere is absorbed by plants by photosynthesis. These plants are then consumed by animals, and carbon gets bioaccumulated into their bodies. These animals and plants eventually die. Upon decomposing, carbon is released in the atmosphere. Some of carbon that is not released back into atmosphere eventually become fossil fuels. And then these fossil fuels are used for man-made activities, which pumps more carbon back into the atmosphere. And then the cycle continues. We can infer in the figure that there are carbon cycle in land and in ocean. And that is the carbon cycle. Now let's move on with the water cycle. I know that among the other cycles that I am going to discuss, water cycle is the most familiar to you all. Water cycle. Water cycle, or also known as hydrologic cycle or hydrological cycle, describe the continuous movement of water on, above, or below the surface of the earth. There are several stages of water cycle. First, evaporation. In evaporation, the sun is the ultimate source of energy, and it powers most of evaporation that occurs on Earth. Evaporation generally happens when the water molecules at the surface of bodies of water become excited and rise into air. These molecules with highest kinetic energy accumulate into water vapor clouds, and evaporation usually takes place below the boiling point of the water. Another process called evapotranspiration occurs when evaporation occurs through leaves of plants. This process contributes to large percentage of water in atmosphere. So, first, evaporation. The next one is the sublimation. Sublimation occurs when snow or ice changes directly into water vapor without becoming water. Usually, it occurs as a result of dry winds and low humidity. Sublimation can be observed in mountain peaks where the air pressure is quite low. The low air pressure helps to sublimate the snow into water vapor as less energy is utilized in the process. Another example of sublimation is phase where fog billows from dry ice. On Earth, the primary source of sublimation from the ice sheet covering the poles of the Earth. So, the first one is evaporation, the next one is sublimation, and the next one is condensation. Condensation, the water vapor that accumulated in atmosphere began to cool down, and due to low temperature found at high altitude, this vapor become tiny droplets of water and ice, and eventually coming together to form clouds. So the first one is the evaporation, next is sublimation, next is condensation, the next one is precipitation, or ito na yung pag-ulan. Above the 0 degrees centigrade, the vapor will condense into water droplets. However, it cannot condense without dust or other impurities. Hence, water vapor attach itself on particles surface. When enough droplets merge, it falls out into the cloud and into the ground below. This process is called precipitation or rainfall. In particularly cold weather or extremely low air pressure, the water droplets freeze and fall into snow or hail. So the first stage is evaporation, next is sublimation, next is condensation, next is precipitation, next is infiltration. What is infiltration? When rainwater gets absorbed into the ground through process of infiltration, the level of absorption varies through the based on material of water has seeped to. For instance, rock will retain comparatively less water than soil. Groundwater can either follow the stream or rivers, but sometimes it might just sink in deeper in other reservoir of water. So the next one is runoff, and it is the last one. If the water from the rainfall does not form a reservoir, it follows gravity and often flowing through the sides of the mountains, hills, and eventually forming river. And this process is called runoff. All the steps mentioned, such as evaporation, sublimation, condensation, precipitation, infiltration, and runoff, occur cyclically with neither a fixed beginning nor an end. So, ibig sabihin, it's either isa sa mga steps na to yung magiging simula ng water cycle. Next, the nitrogen cycle. The air that we breathe contains more nitrogen than oxygen. We need nitrogen because it is important components of protein, the molecules that rule the biological process of body. So, what are the stages of nitrogen cycle? So, the first step in nitrogen cycle is nitrogen fixation. Dinitrogen used to make ammonia. The first step in nitrogen cycle is the nitrogen fixation. Dinitrogen is used to make ammonia. When ammonia appears in soil, it can be more easily taken up by plants. When the plants take ammonia, the process called nitrogen assimilation takes place. Animals accumulate nitrogen too by eating plants and other proteins. And when all those living things die, they form organic matter that fungi and other bacteria feed on. This process of chemical decay reaction is called ammonification. During ammonification, all those big molecules that contain nitrogen are reduced to small ammonia again. And the last step is denitrification. It is when the dinitrogen is created by anaerobic bacteria and releases the oxygen back, or the nitrogen rather, back in the atmosphere. And then the cycle continues. So these are the biological cycles in our nature.